Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chris Rostampor, and I'm the Policy and Communications Coordinator of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. Founded in 2019, the coalition works within the physical science community to raise awareness about the threat of nuclear weapons and ways to mitigate it. Since October 2022, the coalition has been working in partnership with the Arms Control Association, which is an independent, non-governmental, nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. This event is brought to you through this partnership. Our webinar today is titled the Sentinel ICBM Program, Risks, Costs, and Alternatives. We have an excellent panel of experts for you today who are going to discuss and dissect this problem. The discussion is going to be moderated by Dr. Zia Mian. Dr. Mian is a physicist and co-director of Princeton University's program on science and global security. He is a co-founder of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction and has served on the board of the Arms Control Association. Dr. Mian, I'll hand it off to you to introduce the webinar topic and the panelists.
Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's webinar by the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction and the Arms Control Association on the Sentinel ICBM program, Risks, Costs, and Alternatives. So the US Air Force is moving forward with plans to refurbish all of its 450 nuclear missile silos and replace its current fleet of Minuteman III land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles with new Sentinel missiles. This webinar is going to address some of the issues raised by this Sentinel program and the paths forward with regard to addressing the risks and challenges that this program poses. So our speakers today are in the order in which they will present. Sébastien Philippe, a research scholar with Princeton University's program on science and global security. Dr. Philippe's research focuses on modeling the impact of nuclear weapons use on people and planet, and he is a former nuclear weapons system safety engineer for the Ministry of the Armed Forces of France. Professor Sharon K. Weiner, our second speaker, is associate professor at American University School of International Service and a visiting researcher at the Princeton Program on Science and Global Security. Professor Weiner has extensive experience in government, including as a program examiner with the National Security Division at the White House Office of Management and Budget. And our final speaker is Professor Frank von Hippel, Professor Emeritus at the Princeton Program on Science and Global Security, and one of the co-founders of the Princeton Program. He's been working on ICBM issues since the 1970s and is a co-founder of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. Our speakers will speak in the order in which I've introduced them, and there will be time at the end for questions. So let me hand it over now to Dr. Philippe.
Thank you, Dr. Mian, for the kind introduction. I've prepared slides for today's webinar, so I'm just gonna put them up right now. As the first speaker today, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the Sentinel ICBM program, but also present some results of a recent project that we've led at the Princeton Program on Science and Global Security into better modeling and understanding the environmental and human risk associated with current plans. So about 10 years ago, the United States started a complete makeover of its nuclear weapon arsenal, a modernization of all its nuclear weapon system. And central to this future 21st century arsenal are a new generation of nuclear-armed land-based ballistic missiles that are called now the Sentinel. Sentinel will be the 5th generation of solid fuel land-based missiles that were first deployed in the 1960s. And here we're talking about 3 generations of Minuteman missiles, the former MX Peacekeeper missiles that was deployed in the 80s and retired in the mid-2000s, and the Sentinel will be the 5th one. A key purpose of the land-based leg of the triad is to raise the scale of a nuclear attack on the US homeland. And the way this is achieved is essentially by providing a large sets of targets across the country that an adversary would need to attack if it wanted to perform a first potential first nuclear strike against the United States. 1,000 such missile silos were built in the 1960s. It took 5 years back then to build this infrastructure. The 90 feet deep reinforced concrete silos were spread over more than 60,000 square miles in a way to withstand potential nuclear attacks that were back then in the 60s the only way they could be destroyed. So silos are spread out several miles apart from one another, so that no one nuclear incoming nuclear warhead could take out several silos at once. So housed in the silos, you can see here in the short animation are auto missiles. So today, out of those 1,450 silos remain in 5 states, in Montana, North Dakota, and in 1 silo field that is at the intersection of Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. 400 of those silos are loaded with Minuteman III ICBMs, which is the current active generation of missiles. The Sentinel program has been described by Air Force officials as the biggest thing that the Air Force has ever taken on. It is truly an enormous endeavor because as part of this project, it's not just developing and flight testing a new ICBM. It is also refurbishing all 450 existing silos, building new missile alert facilities that control each silos and authorize launch of those missiles. But also command and control infrastructures, and to achieve all of this in a period of time that is less than a decade. So to keep up with the schedule at this point, the Air Force will need to build a silo a week for the next 9 years. And one important thing that people, I guess, and that has been missing so far in public discussions about this new ICBM program are the human and environmental cost and risk that it brings to people and land, in particular communities that are living among the silo fields, but also possibly communities that are living downwind the silo fields. So I mentioned earlier that the silos are made of reinforced concrete and steel lining and essentially hardened to withstand the shock wave of a nuclear detonation happening nearby. But of course, if the nuclear explosion is happening close enough to the silo, it will destroy the silo. The most efficient way to achieve the destruction of the silos is by detonating a warhead at ground level as close as possible to the structure. The mushroom clouds that are generated by such attacks can reach extremely high altitude, several tens of thousands of feet high. So let's say anywhere between 30,000 to 40,000 feet high. And at those altitude, there are extremely high velocity winds. We typically call those the jet streams. So this is winds that are circling all around the northern hemisphere and are crossing the country, but also over country across the globe. But the point here is when such a nuclear attack or nuclear explosion would happen targeted at the silos, enormous amount of radioactivity would be spread out across vast distances. And we've known this for almost, or even more than 50 years, I would say, that strikes on those silos, so presumably at least one nuclear strike on each and every one of the silos that are deployed, if an adversary wanted to attack them, those strikes would inflict enormous damage and cause very large civilian casualties. And the reason is because you would generate such massive amount of fallout that would essentially cross out the country. Now, one interesting thing is a lot of the studies that looked at the potential impact of attacks on US ICBM fields were done in the 70s and 80s. And nothing really has been done as an update as we prepare to move to the Sentinel missile with plans to field the missiles until the 2080s. And so this is the project that we've done here at Princeton. And to do that, we've leveraged modern computational tools and softwares and modern data sets with very high spatial and temporal resolution in terms of weather data, but also population density and building density to account for any protection that people could benefit from in case of fallout happening. And so rather than having average casualty numbers and average areas that could be impacted, we were able to model the potential consequences of nuclear strikes on the US silos for every single day of the past 5 years. And so we found that with the current arsenals that exist today, an attack on the silos would generate obviously massive radioactive fallout, causing possibly 1 to 2 million deaths from acute radiation exposure. But those deaths would not be, of course, just in the United States. They would also be in Canada and some of them in the northern state of Mexico. This is because wind patterns are changing all the time, and the actual impact on the nuclear strike on the silos would highly be dependent on the weather that day. And by combining essentially many different attacks for let's say a 1 year of data, we were able to build this map here that kind of shows for the first time what are the areas that would be most at risk and the areas where people could experience lethal doses of radiation. And so we found that over 300 million people are at risk in North America of receiving lethal doses of radiation should an attack on the silo ever occur. This is a pretty high number. Not all 300 million would experience this at the same time. This is the maximum number of people that can be impacted. In practice, you would get perhaps 10 times less people that could receive those doses. And assuming that people can shelter in place if a nuclear war occur, about a tenth of those would probably die. So this is, we've known that this danger associated with fielding ICBMs, we've known of it for almost 50 years now, at least. over the past 3 years, part of the Sentinel program moving forward required the Air Force to conduct an environmental impact statement of the missile program, and looking at the environmental and human impact of this program. And even that analysis essentially did not look at any of this potential issues. And it's it's surprising in some sense, given that it's maybe one of the primary risk, or at least the largest possible risk for communities that are living with those silos. So for the Air Force, when we released the project, essentially the comment was that any analysis of the impact of nuclear strike on the silos were beyond the scope of any such environmental impact analysis. But nevertheless, we've done that analysis for the public, and we released the data online as part of our project. The URL is missilesonOurland.org, and there is a data section where you can input your zip code or your address and check the potential impact that you would get in your congressional district, or for Native American community in your federally recognized tribal land. But also for communities that are closest to the silos, we provided specific data where in communities where the Air Force presented their environmental impact assessments, but without discussing the potential risk of nuclear strikes on the silos. So all of this is now available online, as I said, and I encourage you to explore the data, but also watch a movie and listen to a podcast that are associated with this project. And I will stop here and give the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Sebastian. So our second speaker is Professor Sharon Weiner. So Sharon, please.
So thanks very much. Thanks to the Coalition and Princeton University for inviting me. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about Sentinel's cost overrun issues, some alternatives to Sentinel, and why I think they are politically viable now. I don't have any slides, but I will have one physical prop that I will show you in just a moment. But first of all, before I start, I want to just make clear that any of the comments I say today are my comments alone, and they shouldn't be expected to represent the opinions of any of the institutions I am currently affiliated with or have ever been affiliated with. So with that out of the way, let's talk about Sentinel. So Sentinel began life, it used to be called GBSD, the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent. So this was one of the products of a deal in 2009 between then President Barack Obama and mostly Republicans in Congress. So the deal was that in return for Senate ratification of the New START Treaty, Obama would support a modernization plan that would modernize literally almost every aspect of the entire US nuclear arsenal. The delivery systems like Sentinel, but also the warheads that go on them and the infrastructure that produces those warheads. So initially, the cost of the ICBM portion of this modernization by itself was estimated at $62 billion. So at the time, this figure was actually seen as pretty unrealistic. I mean, we hadn't made ICBMs in a long time, plus there are political incentives to give cost estimates at the lower end of an expected range. So by 2016, the estimated costs released by the Defense Department had grown from 62 billion to 85 billion. But at the time, the Pentagon actually estimated a price range for Sentinel, and that range was from 85 to 150 billion dollars. But they provided the 85 billion range, I would argue, mostly for political buy-in, to raise fewer eyebrows about the cost of Sentinel. In 2020, the cost estimate was increased to $96 billion. And earlier this month, the Air Force announced that the project would cost 37% more than had been expected, an estimated cost of $131 billion. So now if you're paying attention to the numbers, 62 billion to 131 billion is not an increase of 37, right? But these cost estimate figures change and are based upon different parts of the acquisition timeline for a system. So the 37% cost increase is important for two reasons. One is it starts from the baseline figure, not from the original estimate. And the second reason it's important is it triggers something called a Nunn-McCurdy breach. And now a Nunn-McCurdy breach is something that dates back from legislation that happened during the Reagan administration. And it was really a response to cost and schedule problems with a number of major acquisition programs. And so the Nunn-McCurdy Act requires the Pentagon to inform Congress if a program's procurement cost over the baseline increased by 15%. So that's what's called a significant breach. A critical breach is over 30%. So what we have is a critical breach in the expected cost and schedule estimates for the Sentinel program. And so these assessments and the breach are based upon what's called the program acquisition unit cost. Basically, not the cost of the entire program, but the cost for each Sentinel, how much it will cost to develop, build, and buy each of the missiles. And when the program was baseline, I think it was 2022, the per unit cost was 118 million, and now it's 162 million. That's the over 37% increase. So actually, the other thing I should mention is this is the cost of the missile. It doesn't include the cost of the warheads that would go on top of it. That's entirely separate and a significant additional cost. So a Nunn-McCurdy breach of this magnitude usually signals that a program is going to be terminated. So to save it, the Secretary of Defense has to certify that there are no alternatives. Now, it'll come as no surprise this certification by Secretary of Defense Austin is actually likely. And the logic behind the certification, the logic he's going to use, is why I would argue that the most politically salient alternative to offer is not a lower number of ICBMs, but actually no ICBMs. And so here's why. So Secretary of Defense Austin will no doubt argue that ICBMs are necessary for national security. My guess is there'll be three parts of his argument. One's going to be to reinforce the value of the triad. So these are submarines that can launch nuclear weapons, planes that carry nuclear weapons, and ICBMs. And the argument is they provide important redundant capabilities in case one leg of that triad is no longer viable. So he'll likely also argue that ICBMs are important because they're the most responsive part of the triad. They can be launched in as little as 7 minutes, important in times of a crisis. He's actually also likely to argue, as Sebastian suggested, that their presence serves as a special form of deterrence. Because if any country ever contemplated a nuclear attack on the US, they would know that it makes the most sense to target the ICBMs first, because those are the things that can be launched the most quickly. And the standard planning assumption is that any country, actually it's not any country, Russia's the only country that has the capability really to do this. So the assumption is that they would use 2 warheads per each ICBM silo because the silos are hardened targets. And so thus Russia would expend a significant portion of its arsenal just to destroy those ICBMs, and it would leave behind very few remaining nuclear weapons to contemplate a nuclear war. This is what's sometimes referred to as sponge theory, the idea that those ICBMs in the middle of the United States are actually a sponge that isn't there and intentionally there to soak up Russia's nuclear weapons in the event of an attack. So this is the strategic logic that supports Sentinel, and it's the same logic that supported ICBMs for decades. Couple of problems with this logic. So first of all, the triad didn't begin life based on a strategic rationale. It was a compromise between the Army, Navy, and the Air Force to keep them from arguing for higher and higher budgets because they all wanted a part of the nuclear mission. So it was actually a bureaucratic compromise that then got a strategic rationale tacked onto it as the years progressed. So the arguments that ICBMs are valuable because they're the most responsive part of the arsenal, that's also not right. I mean, yeah, they can be launched in as little as 7 minutes, but it's also the case that submarines can be launched relatively quickly. Now, it takes submarines a little bit longer, maybe potentially around 15 minutes, but depending on where the submarine is parked, it could actually arrive at its target more quickly than an ICBM. So if you want something that has a rapid launch capability and can get to its target quickly, submarines may well be a better bet. At any rate, ICBMs are not the only responsive part. And the notion of sponge theory basically sets up the people in the high plains states as sacrifices to stop Russia from attacking us. But this also assumes that Russia's nuclear strategy essentially mimics US nuclear strategy. And there's plenty of evidence from experts on Russian nuclear strategy that this is actually not the case, that Russia's plans are to target US cities and not military installations. So aside from the fact that some of these arguments that support what's likely to be the basis for Austin's certification of continuing Sentinel, there are a couple of other reasons why I think it's particularly politically salient now to make an argument that ICBMs don't belong in the US nuclear deterrent. So one of those arguments, again, is based on cost overruns. Anyone who pays any attention to the partisan and polarized divides in the US Congress today know that one of those arguments is over money. And if the Air Force was forced to choose between conventional weapons and Sentinel, my guess is they're going to pick the conventional weapon. That's because conventional weapons are useful for potentially fighting adversaries today, and nuclear weapons tend to sit on a shelf and you hope you never actually have to use them. Just really quickly, a couple of other arguments why I think it's politically salient now to argue against ICBMs. So in the early 2020s, the Air Force actually discovered that missileers in the silos have much higher rates of cancer than in other places. So there's a humanitarian argument there that putting people in an airless, concrete-filled, basically tube for long periods of time isn't conducive to their health. But yet that's still the plan for modernization. And a third argument is it's not particularly something that lots of people want to do. So a few years ago, I was at one of the ICBM bases and I started asking the missileers, how many of you, your first choice was to do what you're doing now? And it was almost impossible to find someone whose first choice was to be a missileer. It was actually really hard to find someone whose second choice was to be a missileer. Most of the people in the Air Force that were in missile silos wanted to be either in Cyber Command or Space Command or flying jets. Well, why? Because ICBMs are actually seen as fairly unexciting. They're not new technology. They sit in the ground. They essentially do nothing on a day-to-day basis. This is what has actually led the Air Force to argue that we use our nuclear deterrent every day to try and make people feel like they actually have an active role in defense. So if you want a career in the Air Force, being a missileer is not the way to go. It's not the way to become a general. There are very few higher billets for missileers. And this is one of the reasons that lots of younger generations of people would actually rather do something else. So the argument for zero is that, one, it challenges the justification that Austin will give based on nuclear strategy. And there are other reasons why I think the Air Force will certainly oppose this program, but there are other reasons why the Air Force should really reconsider its commitment to ICBMs. And with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker, which is Frank von Hippel.
So Sebastian has already shown you the silos and the fact that they're fixed, visible targets for Russian ICBMs, and Strategic Command therefore insists on keeping them in a launch on warning posture. The timeline for launch on warning is about 30 minutes, and I show an example here with a 10 warhead Russian silo-based ICBM attacking 10 ICBMs in North Dakota, and you can see that within 4 minutes, the early warning teams have to report that their assessment that this is real or not. That triggers the president being contacted if they assess that it's real. And then the president has basically 7 minutes to decide what to do about this. And then in order for the ICBMs to be launched before the Russian warheads, if real, arrive. Now, this situation has terrified presidents. President Reagan wanted to do away with ballistic missiles. This is one of his arguments. And then secondarily, he wanted to have a missile defense. George W. Bush complained he would not have time to get off the crapper to make this decision. Barack Obama promised that he would end launch on warning, but he was opposed by Strategic Command and concluded that he would not prevail against the combined opposition of the Pentagon and the congressional supporters. General Butler, the first commander of Strategic Command, warned about the resulting consequences. He said, and he testified that the people in Strategic Command who had to sit down and try to frame the detailed guidance for exact destruction of 80% of the adversary's nuclear forces, which was their requirement, when they realized that they could not, in fact, assure those levels of damage if the president chose to ride out an attack, what should they do? They built a construct that powerfully biased the president's decision process toward launch before the arrival of the first enemy warhead. And at that point, all the elements, all the nuances of limited response just went out of the window. The consequences of deterrence built on massive arsenals made up of a triad of forces now simply ensured that neither nation would survive the ensuing Holocaust. Now, the situation would be made worse if multiple warheads were loaded on the ICBMs. Currently, the Minuteman III have one warhead. They did have 3 warheads during the Cold War. And the Sentinel missile is designed to carry 3 heavy warheads. And there are already calls for, in view of China's buildup, to practice uploading those heavy warheads. That would increase the pressure on the president to launch a warning because more U.S. warheads would be at stake. One Russian or Chinese warhead in the future perhaps could destroy 3 U.S. warheads. To facilitate this upload hedge, the National Nuclear Security Administration has a crash program to produce 800 new warheads over 10 years with the upload option. The current estimate is around 20 billion, but that could go much higher. What's the alternative? Well, those of us who have been looking for an alternative have been led on this by former Secretary of Defense William Perry, who would propose to eliminate the ICBMs, would save the money that Sharon just described. One option that has been discussed, if this requires a prolonged discussion, is that you could life extend the Minuteman III. But the submarine-launched ballistic missiles and bombers are sufficient. Currently, the U.S. has 8 ballistic missile submarines at sea at any time, with 160. So a total, they have 20 submarine-launched ballistic missiles each, and each of those could carry up to 8 warheads. So we could have up to 1,280 warheads at sea. The submarines, because of the New START warhead limits and the ICBM warheads, only carry an average of about half that many warheads today. not only are the ICBMs being new ICBMs being built, but also new ballistic missile submarines are being built. As well, in addition, U.S. nuclear bombers could be put on strip alert in the crisis, as they were during the Cold War. Unlike the ICBMs, they can be launched on warning and recalled. The U.S. currently has 40 B-52s, each equipped to carry up to 20 new stealthy long-range nuclear armed air-launched cruise missiles, and is building 100 stealthy B-21 bombers, probably capable of carrying 10 long-range stealthy cruise missiles each. Just to finish, just to let you see what cutaway of our current ballistic missile submarines, showing these two rows of ballistic missiles that they carry. And then the B-52s and how they can carry about 20 cruise missiles each. You can see there are 4 launch pods, pylons. You can attach 3 cruise missiles each. And then there's a rotary launcher carried inside the B-52 that can carry 8. And then a picture of the B-21, which will supplement the B-52s, which seem to be able to last forever, rather than supplant them. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And thank you to all of our speakers. And so we've had over 70 questions so far already, and we don't have time to go through even a small proportion of all of these questions. But in my opinion, this does speak to the enormous interest that the community has on the issues raised by this program and the larger issue of U.S. nuclear weapons policy at this critical juncture, both in the U.S. domestic political cycle with upcoming presidential and congressional elections, as well as in the global arena. So let me just pick 3 thematic questions to begin our discussion, and they're addressed to each of our speakers. So the first question is addressed to Sebastian Philippe, and several questioners have asked, so what specifically of the risks that you've described are new to the Sentinel system, and which ones also applied to the Minuteman III system, but we just weren't discussing them in the same way that you're discussing Sentinel?
Yes, thank you for this question. Yes, so the modeling of what would be the consequences of a nuclear attack on the silos, because the silo location and the number of silos is not meant to change at this point between Minuteman III and Sentinel. The consequences essentially remain the same. So the map that I showed you is also a picture of the map today with the current Minuteman III fleet. As part of our project, we also explored other environmental risks that are associated with Sentinel specifically, that I didn't cover today for the sake of time. And that is, for example, an accident happening at one of the silos, and the potential, for example, for a missile to explode in its tube, and potential for release of plutonium or from the warheads that are on top of those missiles. That type of analysis has not been part of the environmental impact statements that has been published last year. And it's interesting because, as Frank suggested, Sentinel is meant to essentially carry more payload than Minuteman III. And one thing we've learned in the EAS report is that the Sentinel missile is significantly bigger than the Minuteman III missile. So there are risks associated with the new missile that haven't really, or risk analysis that should have been performed or perhaps have been performed, but none of this has been made public in any way for now.
Thank you. The second basket of questions is directed, I think, best to Professor Weiner. And these questions deal with the congressional politics behind the funding of the Sentinel program. And these questions have been framed in various ways with regard to what is the role of pork barrel politics, in other words, local political interests, as well as what suggestions you may have about breaking the organizational or iron triangle politics that support the ICBM caucus in Congress and in military contractors that support these kinds of programs.
So there are two ways to answer this question. I think both of them are truthful, but one of them is more important. So certainly there are pork barrel politics involved because contractors make money from this, significant amounts of money, but those same contractors also make money from other things. They're not going to go bankrupt if Sentinel disappears. I think the larger issue is it's simply too easy for there to be bipartisan consensus that Sentinel is necessary for national security. It's a convenient, I would call, myth that we tell ourselves that deterrence is going to work, it's all going to be fine, and that the risk of proposing this is worth taking given other things in the world. And that's a conversation, a debate that seldom happens in Congress. It's just accepted. And I think that the way to challenge Sentinel in Congress is for people to ask questions about its direct responsibility for national security. I mean, as Sebastian's work shows, there are risks involved to this. Certainly if nuclear weapons are used, that's one thing. But the presumption in these conversations is that they would always be used intentionally, and they would only be used in a crisis, and they would be used after reasonable contemplation about whether or not that use was justified. And I think all of those things are assumptions and likely myths. We know from crisis decision making that people don't make sound judgment. We know that the amount of disinformation and misinformation and trying to understand what other people intentionally do has just blown up all out of proportion. And that it's very difficult now, even if you want to rationally analyze and understand what another country wants to do with nuclear weapons. So every day these things exist, there's a risk that they will be used without intention, inadvertently, or in response to something where if you actually stop to think about it, you wouldn't use them. And I think that's the argument that we have to engage in with members of Congress. That's the argument that we have to question, because that makes people realize maybe these ICBMs aren't essential for your national security. Maybe they're even detrimental to your national security.
Thank you. And a related question that is perhaps for all three speakers is, could you say a little bit about how these delays and complications in Sentinel are likely to affect future cost increases and schedule overruns? Is this the beginning of a longer process of delays and cost increases and related programs with regard to pit production and so on, where there may also be delays and cost increases? So if one or more of you would like to address that question.
So I'll just jump in here really quickly. So one of the questions is what's included in the cost estimate for Sentinel? So originally, when Sentinel was first proposed, the argument was we will only convert silos, we won't build new ones. We won't upgrade the military alert facilities, the launch control facilities, the weapon storage facilities. It'll just be the missile. In fact, if you looked at the original analysis of alternatives that led to Sentinel, Sentinel really looked like Minuteman IV, a really modest upgrade. But that's not what it is now. And there are voices calling for it to even advance well beyond that, to build many more missiles, potentially to have a mobile system of ICBMs, to upload with multiple warheads, to do a variety of things. So certainly that's all going to drive costs up. But one of the things we don't know is, so the first cost estimate, my understanding from the Air Force was that it did include converting the silos, but we don't know if today's cost estimate includes building new silos. We don't know if it includes the launch control facilities, the military alert facilities, the weapons storage facilities, the transporter erectors that carry the missiles to the new facilities. One of the things we know it does not include is the cost of the W-87-1 warhead that it's going to carry. And that modernization bill is currently listed as $12 billion, but that's coming from the National Nuclear Security Administration, the Department of Energy, an agency that is known for making cost overruns in the Department of Defense look reasonable. I mean, some of the projects at NNSA have gone over budget by 500% or more. So the answer to the question is, it's going up. I think the real question is, have we reached the peak of those increases yet? It's not quite clear to me that we have. And of course, if people decide that that Sentinel needs to solve other missions and other things, that price is going to go up exponentially.
Sebastian, please.
Yeah, if I could piggyback on what Professor Weiner just said, I think I absolutely agree with her. One important aspect of our project, and we're very fortunate to work with Scientific American on this, was that some of the reporter went, to the communities that are supposed to welcome Sentinel and try to understand what is the local politics and what building those missiles and new silos actually mean to those communities. And one thing to keep in mind is, yes, this is an enormous construction project. You need to buy land. You need potentially to buy new land. This takes forever. The price of land is going up. There are some people that are opposed to this. To build the silos, the Air Force is going to have to set up worker camps, temporary worker camps, where thousands of workers are going to be housed kind of near the silo fields to perform this work. Those camps don't exist right now. The Air Force has to, or its contractor has to build a preliminary worker camp to build the worker camp that will then build the silos. A few weeks ago, some of our colleagues were doing follow-up work on this in North Dakota with communities that host missiles, including Native American communities. With the windshield, it was -40 Fahrenheit outside. There is no way a silo is built at that temperature at that time of the year. So when we're talking about a silo a week for 9 years, we're not thinking about wintertime in North Dakota and Montana. I mean, this timeline is simply not going to happen. Now, the timeline of 9 years right now, also that is the timeline of the Air Force, more or less. So by 2030, to meet that timeline, they only need 20 missiles to be operational at that date, not the 450 missiles. So the idea that this will be completed on time, those 450 missiles, and on cost, I think, is certainly an illusion. I mean, could only be described as an illusion, I guess, at this point. And the scale of it and what it really means on the ground also, to me, shows that it may not even happen. So when we look at the last time the Air Force tried to field a new missile in the silo field, that was the MX Peacekeeper missile, and the plan was to have 100 of them, and only 50 were built because it also went overrun. The costs also went way above what they were supposed to be. So it may be that naturally not all missiles will be replaced and not all silos will be replaced. But then, what does this mean in terms of the strategy that is presented to us today, and the means to achieve that? And so, yeah, we'll I see Sharon as a follow-on to.
Yeah, I sillily didn't mention the whole command and control infrastructure that will also have to be replaced, which will no doubt cost a whole lot. And I mentioned this also because I promised a prop, so I have to show my prop, which is this is a section of the Hicks cable, which is the current thing that provides command and control to ICBMs. So it's an underground cable, and the latest information is it's going to be replaced by a fiber optic cable. I bought this little section off of eBay. It comes from a dismantled ICBM silo in Missouri, but we don't know even the beginning outlines hardly of the nuclear command and control system, and that's going to be a significant cost.
So Frank, do you want to speak to this question?
Oh, I think it's fine.
Right. So the last batch of questions that were in the pool of questions, both online and submitted in advance, is with regard to what's the best way of making these arguments and having them carry weight in the congressional process, given the things that have been said. I mean, where are the key points of entry into trying to shift these policies? So, Frank, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think launch the danger of accidental nuclear war, I think, is probably the most attention attracting. And that has been a central issue. You don't have to launch the submarine ballistic missiles. Submarines are not vulnerable, and you could have the bombers in the air. So the danger of accidental nuclear war is really focused on the ICBMs. Now this has been a controversial issue all along. There have been amendments to reduce or eliminate the ICBMs in previous Congresses. The Nunn-McCurdy provides a new opportunity to raise these issues and brings into question the credibility of the program. But previous efforts have been defeated, and there are also efforts focused on the crash program that the National Nuclear Security Administration within the DOE is carrying out to produce new warheads for the ICBMs. The DOE wants to retire the warheads that are still available to upload the ICBMs to 3 warheads each. And to make new warheads and to make warheads with new plutonium pits. That's something that the NNSA has not done at any scale since the late, I think it was 1989, and is having a lot of trouble. And because of the demand for 800 new warheads, to bring the 400 warheads on the ICBMs up to 1,200. NNSA is trying to convert a building that was built for another purpose and abandoned because of cost overruns to produce new pits. And the 800 pits are the requirements. The first 10 years of production, so the combined of these 2 new pit production facilities, is the requirements are for the ICBM uploads. So that also has been a focus of controversy in Congress, and so far all these efforts for delay or downsizing have been defeated, but I think it's worth trying again.
So it's time now for us to thank all of our speakers, and I think people appreciate the scale and significance of the political debates that Sentinel creates and the pit production debate that's connected to it, and the opportunity we now have to challenge this program and the very reliance on land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles by the United States. So the video of this webinar will be posted on the websites of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction and the Arms Control Association, and you can find it there afterwards. And if you have any questions specifically that you wanted to have answered, please write to us. You can find all of us online at the Princeton Program on Science and Global Security, and we'll try and answer your questions as best as we can. And so with that, let me hand it over to Chris Rostampour from the Physicists Coalition and the Arms Control Association. Chris, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mian, and thank you to our stellar panelists for this engaging and thought-provoking conversation on the risk and costs associated with the new Sentinel ICBM, as well as alternatives to this program. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. As Dr. Mian mentioned, a video of this webinar is going to be posted on YouTube and will be accessible through the Physicists Coalition and the Arms Control Association's website. Before we close, I would like to briefly mention a few ways for you to become more involved and engaged if you are interested in learning more about issues of arms control and nuclear threat reduction. You can become a member of the Arms Control Association and receive the latest news and analysis in the field through our monthly journal, Arms Control Today, and I'm going to drop a link to that in the chat. If you're a physical scientist or engineer interested in the field, you can join our growing network of scientist advocates and become a member of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. And the link for that will also be dropped in the chat as well. We have an exciting in-person event coming up in April 2024, our DC Engagement Days, which aims to bring physical scientists and engineers based in the United States to the nation's capital for meeting with key policymakers and government officials to discuss nuclear threat reduction policies. You can learn more about this event, which is the first of its kind, through our website. Thank you again to all joining this event, and depending on where you are in the world, I hope that you have a good rest of your day or night. We are adjourned.